This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Coming up, we hear from lawmakers and residents about efforts to pass recreational marijuana in our state. But first, we want to talk about what happened in our nation's capital. Joining us now on the phone is 4th District Congressman Jim Himes. Congressman Himes, welcome back to the show.
Good morning, Lucy.
Americans woke up and saw that Congress returned to the Capitol and certified President-elect Biden's victory. This was just hours after a pro-Trump mob stormed the U.S. Capitol. It was unbelievable watching what was happening in our nation's Capitol. I can't imagine what it was like to be inside that House chamber. Can you tell our listeners, Congressman Himes, what you experienced yesterday afternoon and evening?
Yeah. I'm glad you started the way you did because starting around midnight, we got back to business. We demonstrated that even a violent attack on the Capitol would not stop the Congress from doing what the Constitution said it had to do, which was, of course, to certify the election of Joe Biden. But yes, there was a 20-minute period that was really enormously anxious. We were in the middle of the debate on the state of Arizona on the House floor, and to compress 20 minutes of anxiety into a very brief summary, they locked the room down. It was clear that these insurrectionists had penetrated the Capitol, which, by the way, is worthy of a whole longer discussion on the massive security failure that occurred. They asked us to get the gas masks out from under the seats because they had used tear gas in the rotunda. They actually, in the sort of most nervous moment, announced that they would evacuate us and asked us to stay down because they were afraid that there might be shooting. At that point, officers had their weapons drawn, and there's what I think will become an iconic photo of the Capitol Police using furniture to barricade an entry to the House floor and with their weapons pointed in the direction of the door. Fortunately, shortly thereafter, we were taken out and held along with another roughly 100 members of Congress in a big conference room for a couple of hours.
Many of your colleagues have commended the Capitol Police because there are many of them that also help protect you and your colleagues. But you just referenced that there was a massive failure in security. How did this happen, Congressman Himes?
Well, that, of course, will be a very big question, and it's important to make a distinction here. There were individual acts of real heroism on the part of officers yesterday of the Capitol Police, and we work with these people every day. They are good people. They are competent police officers, and again, they were in an unprecedented situation and performed well. But overall, the notion that a sort of a disorganized, unruly band of people could so quickly get into the Capitol and threaten lawmakers and get into the Speaker's office, where there is all sorts of sensitive information and computers and that sort of thing, is a massive failure of security. And I made reference to them, piling furniture in front of doors. We spend tens of millions of dollars every year to keep that location, one of the most sensitive locations in the country, secure. And when I saw them piling furniture against the door, I really wondered, my God, what have we been spending our money on here? But it chills me to imagine what more organized, whether it's foreign terrorist groups or wacky militias or others who actually do have some training and tactics and capability, might think that they might be able to pull off now as a result of yesterday's security failure.
I wanted to ask you your reaction to President Trump's statements. I know last night his social media director had to tweet since his account had been banned or closed down for several hours. And in that statement, the president says, even though I totally disagree with the outcome of the election and the facts bear me out, which we know is not true, nevertheless, there will be an orderly transition on January 20th. I wanted to ask you, Congressman Himes, your response to what President Trump said to this mob before they descended on the Capitol, and what happens now?
Well, I mean, let's not sugarcoat this. The president promoted a violent insurrection against the United States government, and let's not parse words. We've been watching Donald Trump for 4 years now. We know who this man is. We know he's a deeply, deeply wounded and malevolent individual who cares about nothing other than his own welfare and his own image amongst his supporters. And yesterday, that manifested itself in an insurrection against the United States of America. I've been watching this man for 4 years, so I'm not surprised. And there, somebody asked me yesterday, "Oh, should the president go on TV and speak?" And I said, "No, my God, don't let that happen. We know what he will say. It would have been worse than the sort of bizarre statement that you reference, and it could have led to more violence." So, now the question is, I think, twofold. One, what happens in the next 2 weeks in which he remains president. And sadly, I think the answer to that question is nothing. And maybe that, at least with respect to him. But there's a larger conversation to be had. It was really disheartening to go back to the floor after this insurrection, after this violence, and to hear House member after House member after House member repeat the lies that the president has been spinning for the last 2 months. The lies that, of course, ginned up millions of Americans to believe that the election had been fraudulent. It's a perfectly circular, malignant thing that happened, right? For 2 months, the president of the United States and his supporters lie about what happened in the election, and lo and behold, tens of millions of Americans are now unsure whether the election was secure because they listened to the president, all evidence notwithstanding. And then personally ambitious politicians like Ted Cruz and like Josh Hawley decide that this is a remarkable and historical platform for them to demagogue. And why do they do it? They do it because, oh my goodness, some of my constituents have concerns. Well, of course they do. They've been lied to for 2 months. And I really hope that America can take a step back and ask themselves, is this really the way we want to govern? And do we want to reward the people that were complicit in leading to yesterday's violence?
Congressman Himes, some of your colleagues have talked about impeaching the president. Others have spoken about invoking the 25th Amendment. Your colleague, Congressman Larson, says he supports the removal of the president immediately. Do you believe the president should be removed before January 20th?
Well, there needs to be accountability for what happened. Though it seems like a million years ago, it was really only a couple of days ago that the president committed what appeared to be a federal crime and a crime in the state of Georgia by threatening local officials if they didn't fraudulently say that he'd won the election. So there must be accountability. Again, what happened yesterday was a violent insurrection against the United States government. And 2 weeks from now, we can't be chuckling to ourselves about, oh my goodness, what a silly thing it was that Donald Trump did. There must be accountability. As a practical matter, the Congress is adjourned as of 4 a.m. last night. As a practical matter, the probability that he is impeached by the Congress is pretty close to zero. I won't editorialize around whether that's a good thing or a bad thing because I'm operating at about 2 hours of sleep right now. But I have zero faith whatsoever that the people who are close to the president that could invoke the 25th Amendment have been shaken from their cult-like devotion. It was impressive to see Mike Pence, who has for 4 years now been an adoring supporter of the president, actually undertake his constitutional duties yesterday, even though it knew it would cost him his relationship with the president. But I just don't see Michael Pompeo or Betsy DeVos or other cabinet secretaries in sufficient numbers deciding that we shouldn't take the risk of another 2 weeks of this kind of madness out of the Oval Office.
That's disappointing to hear, but what message does that send to this mob about what they are capable of doing to this country, Congressman?
Well, I went to the MAGA rally the night before the insurrection, and dismantling the package of lies that has sort of become a religion for a lot of these people is going to be a long process. And if Donald Trump were impeached again, that would simply validate their belief that the deep state is and always has been out to get Donald Trump. It's a much longer and I think more challenging thing that we're going to need to do to, in some ways, deprogram people. And I heard it myself. I mean, Donald Trump, as the inheritor of Jesus Christ, to restore this country to the greatness that it once was in the image of Jesus Christ. Alex Jones screaming at the top of his lungs. Roger Stone peddling conspiracy theories. It's going to take longer than just 2 weeks to deprogram the cult of Donald Trump. And by the way, we all, I think, have a role in doing that. What has been coughed up yesterday was the result, I think, of many years of not just complicity by Republicans, but of complicity of elements of the media. We probably all have some self-reflection to do about how what occurred yesterday occurred.
You mentioned that, again, an investigation needs to happen. I know Senator Murphy, a ranking member who oversees Capitol Police funding, looking at how the Capitol was breached so quickly. But I wanted to ask you, Congressman Himes, something else that's really stark to many Americans watching yesterday, the way that these domestic terrorists were treated, the fact that they were able to get into the U.S. Capitol, the fact that there have been few arrests, and they look at what happened during all of those protests for racial justice in our country and the difference in response from law enforcement. What do you say to our listeners about that?
Yeah, it's one of the things that haunted me yesterday, and I'm still trying to get my head around it. It would be easy to say things quickly. That's never a good idea when you're talking about race in this country. But let me say something quickly at risk of maybe not being as precise as I should be. As a privileged white man, I struggle to feel and understand what white privilege looks like. And candidly, over the years, I've really thought about what exactly is that? What does it mean? What are its attributes? Well, when you look at the difference between the almost science fiction-like Star Wars Death Star security response to the BLM, Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, with armored cars and troops, lined up in ranks on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and then you compare that to the reaction and the total lack of preparation yesterday. That is one of the more stark illustrations of white privilege that I've ever seen. When black people are angry and expressing their opinion, the response is one thing and dramatic. When white people, and I am here to tell you that it was all white people yesterday, are angry and expressing their opinion, the reaction could not be more different.
Is this something you hope to work on with your colleagues, Congressman?
Well, a security breach is something you work on with your colleagues. The problem of race in this country, somehow working on it with my colleagues doesn't feel adequate to the task. If there's one silver lining to the protests of and the brutal violence against people like George Floyd this last summer, it is that we have all been shown what I was just describing, which is the just ongoing challenges that we have in making sure that our black brothers and sisters are not shut out, that they are not treated the way they have been treated for 240 years. So working with my colleagues is important, but it's a very small part of the effort that must be made there.
Last question, Congressman. Inauguration Day, 13 days away. Could this happen again?
Well, since yesterday I would have told you that I couldn't imagine what happening, I'm going to be humble and say, of course it could happen again. The inauguration, of course, is inherently a much more challenging security problem because it doesn't happen in what I thought was a well-guarded building. It happens outside. And so, yes, I do think that, or I do think and I hope that there are lots of very competent professionals giving that some thought. But I really do worry. I mean, as you know, I sit on the Intelligence Committee, and I really do worry about the lesson that was taken yesterday. You know, whether it's a domestic militia in the hills of West Virginia or a terrorist group watching CNN from Quetta, Pakistan, there are people who have thought, my God, I never imagined it would be so easy to get a dagger into the very heart of the United States government.
I know I said last question, but I have to ask, is this a prelude of more things to come in our country? We have a president-elect that will take office January 20th, but the damage has been done, Congressman.
Yeah, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a student of history. This country, though we sometimes take one step forward and two steps back, we make progress. We do make progress over time. That's just not an arguable proposition. Sometimes it's too slow. Always it's too slow. But no, I'm an optimist. And look, I think that President-elect Joe Biden is the man for the hour. And I don't say that as a Democrat saying it about another Democrat. Joe Biden has spent his entire career reaching out to people who disagree with him. And Joe Biden, I think, understands a lot of the challenges that are in front of this country. And Joe Biden is not a psychologically wounded narcissist the way Donald Trump is. So, no, I'm hopeful. I think January 20th is a new start. We do have a lot to work on in terms of our civic dialogue. I refuse to believe that the 70 million people who voted for Donald Trump are all like the people that we saw breach the Capitol yesterday. You know, they while we need to condemn the activities that occurred yesterday and condemn so much of what the legacy of Donald Trump is, we also need to listen to each other. And so I think we've all got a role in making sure that yesterday is the sort of, pinnacle of the horridness of the last 4 years, and that it gets better from here.
Jim Himes, again, is the congressman for the 4th District here in Connecticut. Congressman Himes, we appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up after the break, we're going to continue with the show we had planned for the hour, and that is a conversation about recreational marijuana. Stay with us. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. So one of the questions we wanted to ask before what happened yesterday in D.C. was, will 2021 be the year legal marijuana takes off across our country? 11 states and D.C. already allow recreational marijuana, and we know legalization is pending in several other states, including New Jersey, where voters approved it recently. But what could recreational marijuana look like in our state? Today, we talk with lawmakers about an issue which is more complicated than you may think. You can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I wanted to play a clip from our governor, Ned Lamont. This is what he said about recreational marijuana during his State of the State address on Wednesday.
Sports betting, internet gaming, legalized marijuana, they're all happening all around us. Let's not surrender these opportunities to out-of-state markets, or even worse, to underground markets.
So it sounds like the governor is on board with seeing recreational marijuana in our state. Joining us now to talk about efforts to legalize on Zoom, State Representative Michael D'Agostino. He represents Hamden and co-chair of the General Law Committee. Representative D'Agostino, welcome to the show.
Hi, Lucy. Thanks for having me.
Also with us, State Senator Gary Winfield, who represents New Haven and West Haven, and he's co-chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly. Senator Winfield, thank you for coming on the show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So I'll start with you, Representative D'Agostino. We know medical marijuana has been legal in our state since 2012. There's been a push to legalize recreational marijuana for several years now. Where do you stand on this issue?
Well, obviously, I support it. I mean, my committee is in charge of regulating the medical cannabis industry in Connecticut, which, as you noted, has existed for about 10 years now and has grown exponentially. And it's a natural extension of that to take that regulatory environment, that robust regulatory environment that we have, and extend it to recreational cannabis.
And so, talk about the primary motivator to get this done. Do you believe it needs to happen this year, Representative?
I think it needed to happen last year, quite frankly. That and sports betting and some other things where, as the governor correctly stated, we're falling behind on opportunities. And I should note, it's not just economic, obviously. I mean, I'm sure Gary will touch on this as well, but there's obviously an equity component to this, but there's also a public safety component as well. And that sounds a little odd maybe, but if you think about it, if all our surrounding states have legalized, what you're going to do by being an island is secure a black market here in Connecticut, where we've seen in the last couple of years overdoses and, frankly, some deaths with the fentanyl spiked cannabis that you've seen out there in the black market. You're going to lose revenue, and you're also going to, by the way, lose out on impacting the opioid crisis. It's well documented in states with legalization that opioid addiction has gone down, and you're just going to encourage the use of these other more dangerous drugs. In addition to all of that, of course, lose revenue to surrounding states. So there's just a myriad number of reasons to have done this and why we should do it.
Senator Winfield, I'll ask you the same question. What is the primary motivator for lawmakers to get this done this year?
I think that answer actually varies from lawmaker to lawmaker. I think that I've been joined by my child, so you will hear him in the background. But
no problem.
I think that if you ask many legislators, the fact that there is revenue to come from it is a huge part of this. But I think, as Mike suggests, there's another part of this. Many of us feel as though cannabis should have never been made the demon drug that it has been and made illegal. And certainly people harken back to the Nixon administration and some of the things that were said there about why that happened. So I think there are various reasons, but I think the most important thing that we can talk about outside of the machinations of this is the equity part. And that's the part that I'm hoping we get right, because we have been working on this piece of legislation for a long time. And all of the stuff that we're going to talk about this year in my committee or in Mike's committee or in James Maroney's committee, we've already had a conversation about. The part we haven't gotten right is the part on equity.
So I'm going to ask Representative D'Agostino to pick up on that. So let's talk more about the machinations, but also as Senator Winfield has his little one with him. Can you talk about this equity question, how it has evolved in the discussions before lawmakers over the years, Representative D'Agostino?
Sure, and I think about it, and to further to Gary's point, you will get different answers depending on who you speak to, and that's been one of the problems with passing this. And as just sort of a footnote to that, I'll note you hit your head on the machinations point. You hit the nail on the head in your introduction when you said New Jersey just voted to approve it. In every other state that's done this, it's been by public referendum. And I have no doubt if you put this out for a public referendum in Connecticut, it would pass. But we don't have that mechanism in Connecticut, and that's why this is an entirely legislative process. To me, equity is what I call front end and back end. There's a front end piece, which is what opportunities are you going to give in this new industry to classes of people who have been repressed by the war on drugs and targeted by it over the years. As Gary mentioned, actually going back to the 30s, of course, it was the demon drug to vilify Mexican Americans, and then the Nixon administration used it to incarcerate literally, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of young black men for the last 50 years. So what opportunities are you going to give on the front end to people who have been impacted by this? And then on the back end, what are you going to do with the funds that you raise? And that's where, of course, every legislator's got an idea. But from an equity component, how are you going to direct some of, if not all of those funds to curing some of the impact of the war on drugs and frankly, all the things that go along with that in terms of pumping money back into communities that have been underserved for so long. So to me, it's a front end and back end issue. We had discussed last year through the mechanism of an equity commission being able to address some of those issues, looking at very specific census tract data, arrest data, using that a data-driven approach to giving opportunities on the front end and directing funds on the back end. But you will get different answers. When money's involved, you will get many different answers, and that's the challenge from a legislative perspective.
You're hearing State Representative Michael DiAugustino. He represents Hamden, co-chair of the General Law Committee. Also with us on Zoom, State Senator Gary Winfield. He's co-chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Connecticut General Assembly, as we talk again about how there are efforts to legalize recreational marijuana and how it'll move through the General Assembly, the regular session just beginning yesterday. You can join us too. We want to hear how you feel about this issue. The number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. I'm going to take Mark from Hamden first. Mark, go ahead with your question.
Hi, and good morning, and thank you all for having me on. So a little background, I'm a healthcare provider. When I go into work today, 2 out of 3 of my first patients are immunocompromised, have chronic, serious medical issues, and rely on this as medicine. In so doing, that's why I will be referring to it as cannabis throughout this conversation, because that's what it is. It's cannabis. We're not talking about, marijuana as a name has that racial component. So right off the bat, I'd like to begin there. I think you had mentioned several good points about the front end of things and equity. What I'm seeing a lot of and what I'm hearing from patients of the existing medical system is that there is a huge monopoly. The prices for becoming a medical user are outrageous, and that they're not getting what they need from the current framework of dispensaries and just how the whole system is set up. So in so doing, talking about the front end of things, I think both on the recreational and the medical side, we really have to my question basically is what is the provision for home growing going to look like? Because legalization without home growing is really just, it's cruel for medical users, asking them to go to stores during a pandemic when they're immunocompromised and pay, out-of-pocket expenses that are just, frankly, just too much. All
right, Mark, well, let's have Representative DiAugustino answer your question. Go ahead, Representative.
And not covered by insurance either, I'm sure, as Mark was going to touch upon. I guess a few quick points to that. One, we are committed, and we actually have a bill ready to go, devoted to the medical cannabis program to make sure that if we do recreational, the medical will be preserved. Regardless of what we do recreational, we're going to move forward a bill this year that reduces or actually eliminates fees for the medical program. Part of the fees Mark's talking about are these recurring charges for the patients that I agree are too excessive. They're not covered by insurance. People rely on this medicine for their health care, and we need to do more to reduce that. So we are committed to reducing those fees. We're also moving forward a bill that increases the Attorney General's ability to investigate the vertical integration of the growers and dispensaries to make sure that there's not price collusion and price gouging. The third piece I'd address, and Mark's not going to want to hear this as our other advocates in the community, but home grow is likely to not be part of the solution here in Connecticut. My surveys of legislators, I don't know if Gary has a different view of this. I know people feel strongly about it, but my sense is that if home grow were included, recreational cannabis would not pass in Connecticut. There's too many legislators who want to see a more robust regulatory environment and feel that home grow is antithetical to that. You can debate that, but that's where I think we stand on home grow.
Senator Winfield, did you want to add to that?
I don't have much to add to that. I think Rep. D'Agostino is on target. And this is, and let me just say this, on anything that we do, what your legislature looks like, where people come from, who they're interacting with has a lot to do with what you can get out of the legislature. And I think the makeup of the legislature has suggested to us that home grow, despite the conversations I've had with people and my recognition of the importance of the issue, is not a means by which we can pass it through the legislature.
You can join our conversation again as we talk about recreational marijuana, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Sean's calling in from Cromwell. What's your question, Sean?
Hi, yeah. At risk of kind of repeating all the, well-known benefits of legalizing cannabis, my question is, because I agree with all the, previous speakers, but my question is, last time there was a serious concerted effort, last session, it got killed because of inevitable opposition from, activist groups on the right, religious organizations, et cetera. That's inevitably going to happen this time. You guys mentioned that we don't have the opposition, we don't have the option to vote in a referendum. It has to go through the legislature. Are there any contingencies that, the legislature is going to be considering to prevent, this type of effort? Because we know it's going to happen, and it's 2021 and this needs to happen, so.
Representative D'Agostino.
Yes, there are discussions and some research being done now as to whether we could somehow shoehorn in some sort of referendum process in Connecticut, and that would either be a statutory change, or more likely, unfortunately, it would have to almost be a constitutional change, because that's currently the only mechanism that exists for some sort of public vote on an issue. Now, whether or not we proceed that way, obviously we'd like to do this legislatively, but we are talking about contingencies. That's a great question. And as I mentioned, in every other state where this has been done, that's what's needed to be done. And what I hope we don't have to do here, but we are looking at a sort of backup plan.
Did House Speaker Matt Ritter, didn't he say that he wants to put this to voters through an amendment process, Representative?
He did. That's exactly right. The only issue right now with the constitutional amendment process is, unless you have 2/3 of both chambers, you would. It actually takes 2 years to get something implemented, and I feel like that would be far too long. So we're trying to see, hey, where are the votes on this if we wanted to do something like that under the current mechanisms, or can we somehow alter them to give this a little bit more alacrity?
Senator Winfield, we had someone call in, wasn't able to stay on the air, but she wanted to convey that, she is a resident who's worried about what will happen if this is legalized in our state. This is a discussion I know both of you have had with your colleagues and with other public hearings and other sessions, worried about the message it sends to children, worried about people smoking on the job. How do you respond to these concerns, Senator Winfield?
So I have heard when we've done various bills, and definitely when we've been looking to do the legalization of cannabis, about the message we send to children. So the bill doesn't legalize the usage for persons under the age of 21. As I'm sure you know, there have been discussions even about the age of 25. So in and of itself, it's not a bill that allows for that usage. What I think the message, if a child actually is paying attention to what we're saying, is that this is something that is allowed for those who are adults. And I think, there are lots of things that are not things that children can do that we allow for the usage for adults. So I don't know that we're saying to children, you should be using cannabis. I don't know that we're saying that it's good for the usage by children. And I think by having a discussion about 21 versus 25 and the science of the brain and all of that, if we're sending a message, is that we are concerned about that usage by children. So I think the legislature is saying expressly that this is not something for children. So that argument doesn't prevail with me. I hear it, I understand it, but it doesn't prevail with me. In terms of what we're going to see in our state, let's not forget that other states have legalized cannabis, and that many of the things that people have suggested are going to happen in every state as this has happened have not happened. So that's a reality. And should something happen that we didn't intend, like with any other piece of legislation, I'm sure we would revisit it and deal with the issues that we have.
I wanted to go back to you on the question about how an equity program would work in our state. Senator Winfield, we know that Massachusetts also had that as a priority, and I don't think that it has turned out exactly as they envisioned. So I'm wondering if you could talk more about that.
Yeah, so I think part of, and this has been a part of the discussion from the very beginning, part of the discussion has been about, so what do? Do we take the monies from the regulation and taxing of cannabis and put it in the general fund and then dole it back out to programs? Do we allow people from the communities we think have been affected to participate first, and various other things? And with the first participation, we recognize that you can participate first, but if you don't have the resources, the monies to actually participate, that is meaningless. And then, what we've come to think about a little bit more as time has gone on is even the scheme of taking some of these monies, putting them into the budget and then doling them out to programs, perhaps deals with some individuals and maybe even helps those individuals. But what happens is those individuals will tend not to stay where they are. They'll move. They'll go to a place where they can experience a better life. And that's good for the individual, but the place stays the same. And so we've seen this throughout how we've dealt with the communities we're talking about. And our hope is that we can enter a conversation as we deal with cannabis about doing something different, about dealing with not only the individual, but also the places. And so that would mean that we would not just do these programs that help individuals, but deal with the issues of the communities themselves. There are people who are gathered, Jason Ortiz is one of them, who've been, talking about this issue of equity for a long time, but who are in a direct conversation right now. And they can speak more deeply to what that will be.
And that's Jason Ortiz from Cure CT. We'll be hearing from him in just a little bit. You brought up the point about how to make licensing equitable, Senator Winfield, where fees could block out small entrepreneurs. But could you talk about expungement? I know this is not an easy issue. It's complicated as well. And this is something that you have worked on in previous sessions.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I actually think it is easy. We should expunge the records of those who have been charged under the former scheme that we had. But the mechanism by which it happens is, I guess, what would make it difficult. Connecticut is, as we've discovered with many of the things we dealt with, including the Department of Labor and other things, in terms of our systems by which we communicate or use computers, we're not the most advanced. And so there are issues with just automatic expungement. So in the governor's bill last year, Senate Bill 16, and in efforts outside to just fix our systems, we recognize that and we're working on that and trying to make the system, should we be able to pass the bill, as instantaneous as possible. But given, I guess, the antediluvian nature of our equipment, that is not easy. But that's not about what we intend to do. That's about getting the equipment and the resources to do it. So I think that is becoming less and less of an issue.
Representative D'Agostino, I wanted to bring you back in the conversation. We heard from a listener on Twitter. He says Connecticut cities have long borne the cost of the misguided and racist war on drugs in terms of police overspending and resident over-incarceration. This is actually Josh Michtam, the Hartford City councilman. He wants to know whether revenue from legalization will be equally shared with cities. Is that a conversation that is happening?
I'm hesitant just to define this as agree to define this as sort of a city suburb issue. I don't think that's the right way to talk about this. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things we were looking at last year was using census tract data. Where is there poverty? Where is there incarceration? Yes, that's going to be more likely in some of our urban areas. But, when you talk about devoting some of these funds to where there's poverty, to where there have been a number of arrests, believe it or not, you also will see data in sort of the hinterlands of Connecticut as well. So, which obviously have a much different demographic makeup. So I can envision a system where this money, yes, for the most part, is probably going to go to more urban-focused areas that have been hit the hardest, but not exclusively. And I think if we just talk about this as is the money going to the cities or not? That's not the right narrative for the legislature. To put it bluntly, it's what happened last year. There was an article to that effect, and it sort of immediately drew some fault lines that I don't think were were correctly drawn. That's why I'm hoping we'll use more of just a straight data-driven approach rather than saying, oh, the money's just going to go to Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. So that's how we're looking at it. But Jason can talk about some of the further, when you get him on, Jason Ortiz, some of the further evolution of those discussions and how they've moved forward in terms of where the money's going to go.
Senator Winfield, I wanted to ask you if you agree with that before we head to break.
I do agree with that. And I think when the reason that we were looking at those pieces of data is because I think it more clearly expresses what the actual issues are. So I would agree with that.
Again, this is going to be a different legislative session with a lot of Zoom. I'm wondering how, if one of you could just talk briefly about how residents can still, submit testimony and make sure that their concerns are raised before lawmakers as these different committees yet again debate this. Representative D'Agostino.
So you just people can still submit testimony. We will be having Zoom hearings. I would note when it comes to cannabis, actually, we had some very robust hearings last year and even the year before. So believe it or not, when we had the hearing last year, for example, in general law, it didn't go all day. I mean, the advocates are very targeted. They know exactly what to argue. That there's been sort of a maturity of the discussion at the legislature that needs to continue. But I think we'll be able to manage that actually very, very well because there's been these now focused discussions, and you'll talk to Jason, for example, about some additional discussions the governor's office has been having with the advocacy groups, which I think has been very, very important outside of the legislative process.
That's Representative Michael D'Agostino. He's co-chair of the General Law Committee. Also with us today, State Senator Gary Winfield, co-chair of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you both for joining, and I'm sure we'll have you back again to talk about this as the session continues. Now, coming up, we're going to want to talk more about who stands to benefit from recreational marijuana, and again, how will Connecticut address this equity issue? You can join us. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Joining us now on Zoom, Jason Ortiz, president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association and policy director for Cure CT. This is a Connecticut-based advocacy group focused on ensuring equity is achieved when the state ends its prohibition of cannabis. Jason, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Can you respond to what the lawmakers shared? And as you've been watching this process and involved in this process, what's different this year than previous years? Anything?
Well, around the country, cannabis bills have been passing overwhelmingly. And so I think Connecticut has always been ready to legalize in the public opinion sense, but we haven't been able to get down to the details and really build consensus on how we're going to do it. And I do think this year there's more collaboration and there's more interest in really figuring out what is going to be best for our communities. And as somebody that was arrested for cannabis back in the early 2000s, the addressing the specific issues of folks that were impacted negatively by the war on drugs and how we will be able to operate in this space is going to be incredibly important of whether or not this program is successful. Because at this point, we're talking about really stark examples of white privilege. And I think the war on drugs and also the current makeup of the cannabis industry are just about as stark examples of white privilege as you're going to get outside of what we saw happen yesterday. So there are, luckily, other states that have really moved on this issue and have examples of really effective policy that we'll be able to learn from and implement. So I think the timing is right. I think the makeup of the legislature is there to get it done. And I think the advocates, as D'Agostino mentioned earlier, are coming with real tangible, implementable solutions. So I do think, there's the right mix of interest and policy knowledge to really advance this issue this year in Connecticut.
If this passes this year, talk us through how licenses could be distributed to people who may have had prior criminal records and how you'll overcome this hurdle.
Well, there's the way I would do it, and then there's maybe the way that I'll end up going. But I think creating the proper timeline so that we can do an accurate accounting of just how much damage was done by the war on drugs And allowing an equity commission to form before any licenses are given out will allow us to actually answer that question with a data-driven approach. I think we underestimate just how devastating over-policing in certain communities has really been. And what we're talking about there is selective enforcement of laws, specifically on geographic communities. And so when we're thinking about how are we going to get folks back in the industry that were impacted, we have to know who is impacted, right? And so for me personally, I do think a direct interaction with the criminal justice systems, an arrest or conviction, or a direct family member was arrested or convicted, that should set somebody up for being able to enter what MCBA terms more broadly as equity programs. And so for us, equity programs encompass ownership, community investment of tax revenue, and also criminal justice reform. But for this particular conversation, if we look at how, for instance, medical marijuana was rolled out, there was tremendous barriers to entry in that program, and they only issued 4 total licenses for cultivation. So if you have a very limited number of licenses, it forces an economic competition between everyone that wants to become a legal cannabis producer. So the more licenses we're able to give to folks that want to be part of the industry, the more equitable and more impactful. And I also think a higher level of revenue will be generated if it's a more robust system. So personally, I would like to see us use a data-driven approach as far as how much damage was done so we can accurately offer that level of economic opportunity back into those communities, and then let communities of color in the urban centers and also in some of the more rural areas decide how many different licenses do we think make sense for our community. And so this will, of course, become tricky when we think about the different roles of municipal governments versus the state government. But the state can provide a baseline approach to who is an equitable business owner and who maybe is a more traditional business owner, and what kind of supports we can give to make sure they're successful.
We just have about 4 minutes left, Jason. I apologize. We had to shift our hour with the congressman joining us at the top. But I did ask this question to Senator Winfield, and a listener also wants to hear your take on, you had mentioned there are policies in other states that are working. So when we think about equity and Massachusetts, it didn't work out quite as policymakers wanted when we think about the equity issue. So can you give us quickly an idea of how this can be fair in our state if this is legalized?
Yeah, I think the simplest approach is to let the equity applicants go first. So we've seen in a lot of other states, the rollover of the medical industry creates an incredible first mover advantage for those businesses. By inverting that and allowing equity applicants and smaller businesses to get a head start over the bigger players, we can actually incentivize the bigger players to help us get this whole program up and running, to make sure everything makes sense so that we can all go at the same time. Because we're not starting from an equitable starting point. We got to make sure that we actually look at what happened at the medical industry and the current industry as it stands, help that industry become more equitable before we start expanding and bringing more multi-state operators from out of state to come take over a now legal industry. In Massachusetts, they put some amazing programs in place for set aside licenses of different license types, community investment, but the timeline was off, in my opinion. So I think if we invert who actually gets to open up first, making sure that our smaller businesses get the supports they need and they're ready to roll, then we can all enter this new industry from a more equitable place, and that'll benefit not only the equity applicants, but the industry as a whole.
We know that there are residents that are already, again, this is a legitimate career in cannabis. They're licensed to grow hemp. How will this impact them?
Well, I think we have a tremendous number of hemp operators that could quickly turn over into the medical industry immediately, such as Lou Vega from Wepa Farms in Shelton, Connecticut, who's another member of Cure CT. So we have talented people ready to operate at a larger scale. It just takes the will of the state of Connecticut, the help of the governor to give these folks actual opportunities. So I think we can do that first. But here in Connecticut, we already have the talent, even within communities of color, to turn over into great businesses immediately. So I think we just need the opportunity, and we can make it happen.
You don't have a crystal ball, of course, but when you look at all the other states that are legalizing around us, the more Democratic lawmakers in the General Assembly, Vermont is on board as well, the governor. Do you think this will be the year, Jason?
I do. I think we have all the pieces in place, and it's just a matter of squaring a couple circles. But with the momentum of the rest of the country behind us, the talent we have in this state, and I think the leadership of some of the representatives on this call, we can get it done.
Well, I want to thank Jason Ortiz, again, president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association and policy director for Cure Connecticut, for joining us. Jason, thank you.
Thank you. was a pleasure.
Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. You can listen to Where We Live anytime. Just download the show on your favorite podcast app. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.